Welcome to BWC News. I am Elizabeth. 2 days ago, the U.S. Treasury Department released the latest data that got many of our friends talking because in this one data, China's holdings of U.S. debt decreased by $400 million. In last month's data, China increased by $20.5 billion, but this month's data decreased by another $400 million. Now that U.S. bond spreads have started to move higher on the expectation that supply will grow, consumers are starting to look for other higher return alternatives as interest rates rise and banks in some areas go bankrupt. At the same time, bank savings in the U.S. have begun to decline this year. More people withdrawing money from banks will prompt banks to raise interest rates on their savings accounts, and this will be more costly for smaller banks. On the other hand, the Federal Reserve System is continuing to shrink its balance sheet, which is also likely to bring the U.S. capital markets back into chaos. If the U.S. Treasury sells huge amounts of bonds to the market, and the Fed also sells U.S. bonds because of tapering, there will be a serious oversupply in the bond market. Under the combination of the above factors, central banks are bound to further reduce their holdings of U.S. bonds, so it is only normal for China to reduce its holdings of U.S. bonds. Because the price of U.S. bonds rose significantly in March this year, compared with the 2% increase in China's balance at that time, my judgment is that China slightly reduced its holdings, only that the price rose to fill the gap of the reduction. In April, the decrease was only $400 million, which is too small a percentage to judge compared to China's holdings. But in any case, in terms of long-term trends, China's reduction in its U.S. debt holdings is certain. Yellen has repeatedly stated her intention to restore the economy through cooperation with China. Blinken arrived in China on June 18 and met with Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Qin Gang. Against the backdrop of growing tensions between the U.S. and China, the meeting attracted much international attention. Many hoped that it would add some certainty to the stability of the international order, but judging from the press releases issued by both sides afterwards, the outcome does not seem to have exceeded previous expectations. According to the press release issued by the Chinese side, Qin Gang and Blinken reached a series of consensus during the meeting and had frank, in-depth and constructive communication, and both sides agreed to continue to promote the Bali Consensus. Blinken invited Qin Gang to visit the United States, and both sides exchanged views on a series of major international issues. Slightly understand the diplomatic hackneyed netizens, probably be able to see the general meaning of this circular. The outside world also noted that after the meeting, the two sides did not release a joint statement, no common meeting statement, and did not hold a joint press conference. Their respective media also only issued their own content. It is clear that China and the United States did not talk together. Another obvious attitude is that Blinken issued an invitation to Qin to visit the U.S., and the Chinese side's reply was, willing to visit the U.S. when it is convenient for both sides. This indicates that China believes that Washington has not yet shown enough sincerity to convince the Chinese side that it can now take U.S.-China relations a step further. Before the meeting, a number of media outlets and experts and scholars took the precaution that a breakthrough in the negotiations between the U.S. and China was unlikely, that the U.S. had not fundamentally changed its policy toward China, and that China's strategic orientation toward the U.S. had not been reversed. However, the outside world is relieved that although nothing has been discussed between China and the United States, the two sides have not torn their faces apart. As the saying goes, if you do something, you will see each other later. This is good news against a backdrop of growing uncertainty. What we can foresee is that after Blinken's return to Washington, there will likely be a series of backlashes in U.S. policy toward China, with further snarls against China and more sanctions, siege and containment measures. Before going to China, Blinken made a special trip to Anchorage, where he still seemed unable to forget Yang Jiechi's remark that the United States is not qualified to talk to China from a position on the ground. This time his visit to China also failed to get any message that China recognizes the U.S. position of strength. Washington is under the illusion that its extreme pressure on China has been effective and that China is paying the price, but the fact that China has not yielded means that the price is not heavy enough, so the United States needs stronger extreme pressure. The immediate purpose of Blinken's trip to China was to ensure that there would be no military conflict between the United States and China, but more importantly, to assess the effectiveness of the extreme pressure he wanted to see how many more sanctions and how many more countries would be needed to force China to accept a position of strength. But only if the United States really has such a position of power. The U.S. hegemonic system is now riddled with holes. The dying imperialist behemoth has not yet fallen, but the outside world clearly sees that it is out of its depth. The world is experiencing a wave of de-dollarization, the economic rise of emerging markets, and the third world is an irreversible historical trend, and the narrative system, fabricated by the West, is in tatters and its influence on the world is weakening. What can Blinken see in China? He can only see an upwardly mobile power with a degree of vitality and resilience that exceeds the upper limits of America's ability to contain it.